All right. Good morning, afternoon, and evening, everyone. Hope you are doing well. Welcome to Lunch and Learn by EcoBusiness. I'm Liang Lei, a correspondent at EcoBusiness based in Singapore, and I'll be your host for today. For those joining for the first time, Lunch and Learn is a new monthly series we just launched this year. It's basically an easy 1 hour session covering hot sustainability topics with subject matter experts. So today we'll be talking about decarbonization tech, specifically carbon capture utilization and storage, or CCUS, as well as hydrogen fuel. So we'll be hearing from two experts on the lay of the land for these two very exciting technologies. We'll talk about their promise, current roadblocks, opportunities for rapidly developing Southeast Asia, and the innovations required to accelerate the whole process. So there'll be presentations by the experts, followed by a Q&A session where you can post your questions to the experts. The session is hosted in partnership with the Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Association of Singapore and EcoBusiness's Deliverability Challenge. So just a little more about the Deliverability Challenge. It's a global initiative that searches for and accelerates the adoption of innovative solutions to challenges faced by tropical cities. The challenge provides 1 million Singapore dollars to fund game-changing solutions, and it also provides the ecosystem support to take ideas from lab to market. It's the 5th year that EcoBusiness is holding this competition. So today's topic is one of 3 themes in the contest this year, which are decarbonization, what we're talking about today. There's also food and agri-tech, as well as nature-based solutions. So for decarbonization specifically, we're looking for technologies that help to capture, store, or use carbon more effectively and at bigger volumes. We're also looking at innovations in hydrogen fuel that reduces cost and contributes to new use cases. So past winners for the competition include, for example, a startup that converts dissolved carbon dioxide in seawater into solids that can be used in construction. And in another edition, it was won by a venture that is creating lab-grown milk. So if you're a dreamer, builder, or innovator, or know someone who fits the bill, here's the URL to the competition site on screen. It's www.deliverabilitychallenge.org. Submissions close on 13th April. That's just under 2 weeks from now. So hope today's session will inspire some of you to refine your ideas in the next few days and give this challenge a shot. Before we hear from the experts, let me just quickly set the stage for today's discussions. I don't think anyone is unfamiliar with this picture. We all know that global warming is rampant. We are just fractions of a unit shy of 1.5 degrees Celsius rise in global temperatures. If we go beyond that, we may face irreversible damage to human and natural systems. So we all know that. I guess the tougher question now is how do we then take rapid steps to decarbonize, especially for a region like Southeast Asia? If you look at our energy consumption in the region, a good 75% is still fossil fuels. Renewables is the fastest growing energy segment, but the phase out of coal, gas, and oil will still take a few decades at least. So in the meantime, total energy demand is also rising rapidly as these countries develop in the region. It's estimated to go 60% higher in 2040. Of course, renewables are taking center stage now in the fight against climate change, but there are also other technologies on the horizon which might be able to give the climate battle just that little boost. So that's why we're here with 2 of these technologies. One is, like I said, CCUS. In very simple terms, it's a way to capture carbon emissions and either store it underground or convert it into another useful material. The other is hydrogen fuel. It's not new per se, as it's been widely produced from fossil fuels for industrial users. Cleaner forms of hydrogen production. They're still nascent, but they're being developed today. And the world, of course, is tinkering with ways to replace fossil fuels with clean hydrogen. Of course, there are also challenges, and some of them concern their very role in a rapidly decarbonizing world because of their sometimes close links to the fossil fuel industry. So now I'm delighted to introduce our speakers here with us today. We'll get the ball rolling with their presentations. We have Mark Allen, who is the founder of climate tech platform Unravel Carbon, which uses software and analytics to track and reduce businesses' carbon emissions. Mark is a chemical engineer by training and has 2 decades of experience in the energy sector, so he's familiar with both CCUS and hydrogen projects. We also have with us today Noel Chin. He's the president of the Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Association of Singapore. Noel's worked on projects with hydrogen fuel cells in the past, and he has been very active in connecting the research and industry community together through the association he founded. Thank you for being with us here, Mark and Noel. I'd like to pass on the time now to Mark, who will present an overview of CCUS and low carbon hydrogen in the region. So anytime, Mark.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Liang. And yes, thanks all for giving up your lunchtime today to come and learn a little bit about hydrogen and CCS. So I'm going to go through a few things here around what is the role of hydrogen and CCUS and indeed electrification in decarbonisation. So just a few slides here. So I'd like to get on to the obviously the discussion as well. So if we, take a little bit of a step back and we think about the targets that countries have set and the requirement to decarbonise. So this provides a little bit of a status update of where countries are at with their nationally determined contributions, their UN targets under the Paris Agreement. And you can see those in green, they've all committed to set a stronger target. And then, of course, the UN has stated that coming into Cairo COP27, all countries are to come with increased ambition as well. So, taking that view, all countries are going to be required to decarbonise at a faster rate going forward. Obviously, that's impacted everything we're doing here in Singapore. So, and you may have seen some of the speeches around the Singapore budget speech just recently and what the country's doing, particularly with respect to the carbon tax, increasing it from $5 per tonne now up to a potential price of $50 to $80 per tonne in 2030. Some of the things that they're doing around that, of course, are to flag or potentially implement a future revision to targets, right, and achieve net zero by or around 2050, which was different to the as soon as practicable in the second half of the century. That hasn't yet been formalized in the low emissions development strategy nor the nationally determined contribution, but in the lead up to Cairo, I would expect a little bit of motion in this area as well. Not to mention companies are going to be needing to understand their exposure, look at what decarbonisation means to them, and disclose to SGX for listcos coming up this year. Add on top of that, net zero commitments that have been made by a number of countries, particularly in the region. So 90% of global GDP is already covered by a net zero target of some description. And we can see here across the region those that have, in some cases, achieved net zero emissions, but in others, where net zero commitments have been put in law or in policy documents, all the way down to those that haven't set a target yet, which is, on this map, primarily Mongolia and the Philippines. But there's a lot of talk in this area and a lot of discussion around achieving net zero. Then really important about how do we do that? In terms of decarbonisation pathways, there's a real benefit in decarbonising quicker now and decarbonising sooner rather than later. So this little chart here shows various decarbonisation rates, from the slowest, so leaving it all to the last minute, to the fastest, starting to decarbonise strongly today. And actually the impact that it has on cumulative emissions. Climate change is actually a cumulative emissions problem. So it's not about the absolute emissions we put up each year, but it's how much emissions we put in over time. And taking the slow way, doing it all in the last minute, adds significantly more cumulative emissions than decarbonising today. So it's really an impetus to start decarbonising as fast as possible. And we're looking at now these three ways, these three key pillars in terms of decarbonisation. Firstly, the electricity system. Number one, electrifying everything that can be cost effectively electrified, right? So we're talking about electrification of transportation, something Singapore is very big on, electrifying the built environment. So getting rid of where we're currently using gas for residential or commercial uses, and of course electrifying low-grade heat, so replacing again gas or LPG with electrons. Then we're also maximizing our efficiency, so installing high efficiency motors, installing industrial chillers, maximizing efficiency of distribution, etc., and making sure that all of the electrons we generate get to where they need to be and are used in the most efficient manner. Then we can also, at the same time, these are not sequential, everything gets brought up together. At the same time, we're looking at how do we generate zero carbon energy, right? And because renewables are inherently intermittent, how do we solve the energy storage question, which is where there's a big role for hydrogen or ammonia or methane or one of the hydrogen carriers. On a cost basis, yes, wind and solar are the cheapest way to generate electricity on a levelized cost of energy basis today. When we start to include things like storage, it actually takes renewable energy onto par with some of the fossil fuel energies at the moment, even with a carbon price. So, we need to solve this battery storage, this intermittency issue. When we start to look at that, then what are the ways in which the different technologies we have available to store energy? Hydrogen itself plays a big role in terms of something that can store a lot of energy and can discharge it over a long period. Right? Synthetic methane also lives in there. Some of these sort of physical methods, pumped hydro, cryogenic air, compressed air, they can all play that role as well. A lot of the focus is currently on lithium-ion batteries, but an issue is they discharge over a relatively short time. So, and the way you store a lot is just by having more and more batteries one after the other. So they're not as good for sort of grid-level storage and long-term storage. And this is where we start to see, certainly in an energy management area, hydrogen playing a big role. So if we start to look at some of the potential opportunities around using hydrogen, what are the demand centers that we have for hydrogen? And we've got a cool picture here of the Kawasaki ship, the Swiss Frontier, that just delivered its first load of liquid hydrogen to Japan from Australia. So hydrogen itself forms an important part of the zero carbon future, but there are a number of technical challenges, particularly around storage and transport of hydrogen. And a lot of these issues are actually as a result of the physics of hydrogen, right? They're physical characteristics of the molecule that make it difficult to store and difficult to transport because, it's very low density, it's very small, it tends to leak, and has to be stored at really high pressure or, really low temperature. Key sectors in which we're going to use it going forward and currently use it. So industrial feedstock is a big place right now. And, changing that to green hydrogen is almost a no-brainer. Replacement for natural gas for high temperature applications, using hydrogen to provide that heat that we might need in power generation or in boilers, etc. Hard to decarbonize transport, ships and planes and long-range off-road vehicles, etc. And of course, energy storage and energy transfer. And taking renewable energy from where we have lots of renewable energy and sending that to places that don't necessarily have that same access to renewable energy. Then looking at the different methods of hydrogen production, there's the current sort of industry standard, the brown or grey as it's called. When I was in the hydrogen industry, it didn't have any colours, but now it does. So producing hydrogen from fossil fuels using a steam reforming plant, partial oxidation gasification, well-established process, very mature, generates quite a lot of CO2. Blue hydrogen is where we use a fossil fuel fired hydrogen plant, but we install carbon capture and storage on top of that, two operating in the world currently. And then finally, the holy grail, green hydrogen, so producing hydrogen from electrolysis using green energy or clean energy. And one of the advancements is electrolyzers can now actually handle some intermittency in the energy that they receive. To give you an idea of cost variation, we're talking about 80 cents a kilogram for brown or grey hydrogen. We're talking maybe $2 to $2.50 per kilogram for blue, and then $5 to $8 for green hydrogen. We look at three key areas. So the capture part, so taking a CO2 stream or a stream that's got CO2 in it, running it through pieces of equipment like amine absorption or membranes, etc. And we can separate out the CO2 from that. Then we have the portion that is transport. So we capture CO2, we make pure CO2. We either liquefy it or compress it into what's called dense phase, then transport it to a storage location. and then we inject it underground. So we actually inject it into the rock. So understanding subsurface geology is key here. So making sure that, it can accept CO2. You're not going to break the rock apart when you inject the CO2 in there, making sure it doesn't move too far nor leak out. So that's the storage part. CCS does need to be scaled up significantly. This little chart here just shows what's required under the IEA's Sustainable Development Scenario, which is a modest scenario that doesn't necessarily achieve the 1.5 degree goal, needing to put into the ground 1.5 gigatons per year by 2040, and existing capacity is effectively zero. The development pipeline is also zero. So needs massive scale up. We are looking at using CCS in chemicals, in hydrogen, in steel, and cement, etc. You can see here where the current projects are and which ones are in operation. The red dots are operation, but most of them, particularly most of the ones in North America, are capturing CO2 to put into an oil field to get more oil out. So a little bit sort of giving with one hand and taking with the other with respect to climate change. And then on the utilization pathways, then what we have is the CO2 as a product. So rather than just storing it, right, the projects assign value because it gets sold as a product that we need to use. So really important things to consider, what is the market size, and of course, where can you sell it? Do you have an offtake? In the absence of a utilization pathway, so just putting it into storage, typically you need a carbon price of somewhere around $70 to $150 a ton to justify that. If you can sell your CO2 for $70 to $150 a ton, then you've got a viable utilization project. So we've got some areas where we use direct use of CO2 in products, food, and soil recovery, solvents, and then some where we transform CO2 into something else, plastics, chemicals, fuels, etc. But what's important here is just the numbers, right? So 76, 90, 220, 230 million tons is the total global market for CO2 today, right? So that's a far cry from 30 over billion tons that's generated just by the energy industry currently. So yeah, there's a little bit of a mismatch, I guess, in terms of the market size versus the available CO2. Maybe new markets will open up. I see a lot of potential in, say, minerals aggregate. So overall, the drivers are getting stronger. Much of the world's GDP covered by net zero, and hydrogen and CCUS certainly have a role to play there. Thank you very much. I'll pass back to Liang Lei.
All right. Yeah, thank you for the presentation, Mark. It was a great overview of, in a sense, how much more the world needs to do with decarbonization tech, and also the opportunities around hydrogen and CCUS. And now let me move on to the second presentation by Noel. Noel will do a quick deep dive into all things clean hydrogen. So Noel, the floor is yours.
So for today's session, I'll just go through the role of green hydrogen and fuel cells. So again, Noel Chin from the Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Association of Singapore. Just a quick recap of Singapore's energy resilience and sector. So back in 2019, there was a fourth switch that was added to our energy sector, focusing on low carbon alternative energy, where we have both CCUS as well as hydrogen as part of our efforts to decarbonize the energy sector. And a feasibility study was actually commissioned by the Singapore government, and it was carried out by KBR, the appointed consultant, to explore green hydrogen imports and downstream applications for Singapore. So while the plan was to focus on the long-term feasibility of hydrogen in terms of global supply markets, cost of hydrogen, energy carriers, and infrastructure requirements, the report also identified the sectors that could potentially transit to hydrogen. And in the near term, our focus will be on R&D to develop technologies and solutions and carry out pilot trials to assess the feasibility and to build out capabilities in Singapore. Earlier this month, the Energy 2050 Committee announced a long-term strategy to decarbonize our energy sector by 2050. And hydrogen plays an important role in the medium to the long term and in the long run. So what's green hydrogen and how is it produced? I think Mark has actually mentioned this earlier on. Traditionally, hydrogen was produced using steam methane reforming process where natural gas is used as a fuel and where CO2 is emitted. Whereas in green hydrogen, is produced through a process called electrolysis where water is split into hydrogen and oxygen. The energy that powers the electrolyzers come from excess renewable energy. Unfortunately, Singapore, as a renewable disadvantaged country, is unable to produce its own green hydrogen, except for the pilot trial at SPTI, which I will explain later on. So there are three main types of electrolyzers, each with its own advantages and disadvantages. Of the three, the anion exchange membrane electrolyzer seems to be the most promising to date because it's able to lower production costs and is a lot more easier to implement. So we are pleased to actually share that our own local startup, SunGreen H2, is actually doing this and exploring overseas partnerships. Here are the various energy carrier options that Singapore is exploring, such as green ammonia, liquid organic hydrogen carriers, liquefied hydrogen. While each of them have their own merits, we have not closed our doors to any of them. It is thus important to carry out feasibility studies to explore each of these options. Next, this is a snapshot of the global supply chain compiled by KBR. Countries like Australia, Canada, Norway, Oman, Chile have incorporated green hydrogen exports in their hydrogen roadmaps and have started building up the infrastructure and production of green hydrogen. Even Sarawak, our closest neighbor, is currently working on green hydrogen production using hydropower and being the first in Southeast Asia to carry out a fuel cell vehicle trial with green hydrogen production. This slide provides an overview of the hydrogen supply chain. Earlier, we have looked at how green hydrogen is produced and the various forms of energy carrier. To be able to ship these carriers, vessels would need to be built to store and transport it, especially for liquefied hydrogen at minus 253 degrees Celsius. At the receiving end, ports will require specialized facilities to offload the carrier, store and process them before they can be distributed in the form of hydrogen to the different sectors. What factors contribute to the eventual price of green hydrogen imports? As shared in the KBR report, one of the factors is the additional transformation and liberation costs, depending on the carrier. In the case of the NEOM project in Australia, this accounts for up to 60% of the landed cost of hydrogen. Other factors such as the cost of electrolyzers and the renewable energy from the source country are also important. But there is optimism that the cost of hydrogen would eventually fall due to the more cost-effective transformation and liberation technologies, which is why there's a need for continual R&D, as well as the cost of electrolyzers and renewable energy falling in the long term. Projections by the International Renewable Energy, or IRENA, estimates that the cost of electrolyzers will be halved by 2040. Similarly, the report also highlighted other ways to secure low-carbon hydrogen. Other than shipping, you can consider piping hydrogen from nearby sources, or domestic production via SMS with CCUS. And we also look at electrolysis using electricity imports, biomass gasification, and methane pyrolysis. Looking at how hydrogen can play an important role for the sectors identified that could transit to hydrogen, some can take place in the medium term, for example, mobility, industrial, maritime, and aviation, while others will feature in the long-term plans, for example, power plants. The next part of my presentation will dive into some of the applications for hydrogen in Singapore. So with the availability of hydrogen, the question is, how would this be used to produce electricity? This is where the fuel cell comes into play. In its simplest form, an individual cell contains two electrodes, an anode and a cathode, and the electrolyte layer. Hydrogen is fed into the anode, while air is fed into the cathode. And the catalyst at the anode separates the hydrogen molecules into protons and electrons, where the protons pass through the membrane and the electrons will go through an external electrical circuit which generates the electrical current. The hydrogen protons then migrate to the electrolyte to the cathode to combine with oxygen to produce water and heat. So what are the advantages of fuel cells? First of all, there are no moving parts, no servicing is required. And secondly, it produces DC electricity, which can be used directly. Fuel cells is not new in Singapore. They have been used as backup power for two of our local hospitals, Tan Tock Seng Hospital and Khoo Teck Puat Hospital, which supports the Fire Command Center, as it has a faster startup time compared to diesel gensets. To overcome restrictions on storage of hydrogen, methanol is stored as a fuel and is converted into hydrogen on demand. Mobile fuel cell systems have been used in other countries or areas where there is no access to electricity. There are some of the examples, these are some of the examples where fuel cells are used in buildings, from warehouses to residential homes to data centers. The benefit is derived where the fuel cell is used as a cogen system where it produces electricity and heat. The heat is either used directly, as in the case of residential homes in Japan, or indirectly to power absorption chiller to provide cooling. In Microsoft's case, while the capex for fuel cell is high, they saw the advantage of replacing the diesel gensets, which sits there and do nothing according to them, with fuel cells that will run as primary power. There's also growing interest in data centers in Singapore to explore the use of fuel cells to replace the diesel gensets and support DC grid network. In this slide here, we will look at fuel cells used to support small-scale applications such as PMDs and UAVs. The advantage in using fuel cells in place of batteries for power is that it's lighter, has a longer range, faster refilling time, and lower environmental impact in terms of the absence of heavy metals. Some of our homegrown companies who have used fuel cell applications in this area would be One Berry, which is a local SME specializing in security and surveillance, where they have installed island-wide stationary cameras powered by solar and methanol fuel cells. The other one is Spectronic, also another local startup, where the fuel cells are used for UAVs and vehicles. There's interest to carry out pilot trials for heavy goods vehicles. In PSA's project involving one heavy goods vehicle and a hydrogen refilling station, using hydrogen that's supplied by Chiyoda in liquid organic hydrogen form. For Penn United and Sabana Jurong, they're exploring the feasibility of using fuel cells to power their concrete mixer trucks. There are also some private consortium that is planning to carry out a public road trial for fuel cell fleet vehicles and possibly buses. As mentioned earlier, this is a demonstration project by SP Training Institute for on-site green hydrogen production. Renewable energy is produced from the 40 kilowatt peak solar PVs and will power an electrolyzer to produce hydrogen, which is stored in metal hydride. This will be used to produce electricity to support the concept lab operation through a fuel cell. Safety measures have to be put in place to reduce the risk of any fire. There are other ways to produce low carbon hydrogen, such as a waste to energy gasification system, which is currently tested at Gardens by the Bay. The Energy Observer is a catamaran that was retrofitted to achieve net zero emissions as it sailed across the globe since 2017 and landed on Singapore shores in March 2022. We were honored to be able to board the vessel and view some of the interesting technologies that were used, such as the widespread use of solar panels, storage of this renewable energy in lithium-ion batteries, and the excess energy will be used to produce hydrogen, especially during stopovers. Toyota Mirai has also put in a fuel cell system, a 30 kilowatt fuel cell system to produce electricity from the hydrogen that's being produced. Some interesting facts: the wind turbines that were originally installed in the ship was replaced by wind sails that aided the vessels to sail more efficiently. And this was actually the first to be tried. So the question remains, can Singapore feature in the hydrogen value chain? As shared earlier, we have our Singapore's SMEs who are specializing in various fuels and system integrations. And what would be useful is for Singapore to continue to focus on R&D led by our IHLs and research institutions. The encouraging to note that the Singapore government has provided funding support from the low carbon energy research funding initiatives for hydrogen and CCUS projects. And in order for hydrogen trials to take place, there's also a need to focus on development of standards. Currently, there are no standards for specific use of hydrogen and construction of hydrogen refilling stations in Singapore. So there's a need to actually develop such standards in order for the industry to be able to apply and deploy such projects. Secondly, training. How do we professionalize our industry and upskill them? HFCAS is actually in the midst of developing courses, both fundamental courses as well as master classes, so as to upskill our workforce to be ready once hydrogen comes to the shores. Okay, last but not least, how can we all come under one coordinated community of practitioners, such as industry leaders and government, to support the push for hydrogen in our country's efforts to decarbonize our energy sector and contribute to lowering the carbon emissions? This unenviable task is taken up by the Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Association of Singapore to support the push for hydrogen and fuel cell development and deployment by promoting, encouraging, and assisting in hydrogen and fuel cell related activities. Thank you.
And yeah, thank you, Noel. That was a great dive into all the promises of hydrogen and fuel cell technology for both Singapore, and you gave some overseas examples too. I think that's great. And now let's move on to the Q&A segment. Once again, for the audience, I'd like to encourage you to, if you have any burning questions you have, please do type them down in the chat box at the bottom of the screen. When you type the questions, do indicate if you want any specific speaker to answer them as well. So I'll help to moderate that. But all right, let me see. I have some questions I would like to start on my own. The first one is for both speakers, actually. Do you think the current development and commercialization of both CCUS and hydrogen is fast enough to support net zero by 2050? I mean, there's a super important global target that we've set. You know, what's the key areas to focus on for both technologies? Mark, do you want to give an overview for both first?
Yeah, look, a great question. And I'll speak in terms of, firstly, technology for CCUS. The technology already exists. A lot of it is already quite mature. The issue is really commercials. So how do we generate a value of CO2 that is enough to give you a positive business case for a carbon capture and storage plant, right? So they're very high capital projects. And as I said, need quite a high break-even carbon value, if you like, to justify that project. So yeah, there have been some technical challenges with some of the projects, but so CCS in itself has been around for a little while and can certainly be deployed. But it's just the cost, I guess, that holds it back from being deployed at scale. It's pretty similar to green hydrogen, at least. Hydrogen production is very mature, you know, using a steam methane reforming unit every day, and it's very cost effective. But green hydrogen, I think, needs a bit of help on the commercialization side, as well as transport and storage. But I'll let Noel actually speak more about the hydrogen side, so he gets a chance to say something.
Thanks, Mark. I think you covered most of the things. I think cost is always the most important factor if you're looking at commercialization. As mentioned earlier on, I think costs of electrolyzers are still very high. There's also a need to take into account the cost of transportation, as well as the liberation cost for green hydrogen. I think probably in the next couple of years, with more R&D in this area, how we can actually make the process more efficient, make it more effective, looking at cheaper materials, that would actually help to bring down the cost of green hydrogen eventually.
I should say there was just recently some really good advancements, desktop university scale at the moment in electrolyzer technology that looks like it might be increasing efficiency, all to do with transport mechanisms inside the electrolyzer. That sort of thing is where I see a lot of innovation coming in, solid oxide fuel cells and other things.
That's right. Yeah. So I think for the from now to probably 2030 or just past 2030, I think the focus will really be on how the research work, research and development work, and to be able to identify some of the pathways to actually get us to bring down the cost of hydrogen.
Awesome. And I see questions starting to stream in, but I would like to just ask one more on my part before I move on to those in the chat. In a sense, is that aspects of carbon capture and hydrogen still overlap quite a bit with the fossil fuel industry. So, for example, the CCUS in coal or gas plants, and using the carbon emissions in enhanced oil recovery to recoup some of the costs. And on the hydrogen side, of course, the dominant form of production is now still using natural gas and methane. So for both speakers, I'm just wondering what's your take on the arguments that these technologies prolong the runtime of fossil fuels when it should really be phased out in the next few years. Noel, do you want to start with hydrogen first?
Yeah, I think again, while the whole global green hydrogen supply chain is being developed, right now for Singapore, it's really looking at if we want to carry out pilot trials, where are we going to get green hydrogen from? I think the easiest way is for us to actually consider blue hydrogen. And that's where CCUS comes into play. So depending on you, Mark. And it's important for us to carry out these trials with the blue hydrogen and to be able to validate what's the feasibility of such applications. So I think definitely it would need to be, it plays an important role now, but it will slowly transit. So we move from fossil fuels towards green hydrogen once the supply chain has been developed.
I suppose, and that's a really excellent point, and it's something I think about a lot as well. Using blue hydrogen as almost a transition, and what I think that does actually is, getting more blue hydrogen into the mix starts to scale up the supply chain aspects and actually starts to increase demand pools as well, right? So we start to grow transport. We get to test different hydrogen carriers, ammonia, loaded organics, synthetic methane, metal hydrides, whatever. We get to test those and develop the technology we need to support those, as well as creating demand side pools and create a market. Because right now, the hydrogen industry is the same place the LNG industry was in the 80s, right? Without that whole end-to-end, you don't have a project, right? You can generate as much hydrogen as you like, but if you're not selling it to anyone, you can't transport it to them, you don't have anything. You don't have a business case. On the CCS side, so yeah, there is obviously a school of thought that says that is prolonging the fossil fuel industry. Right now, I don't personally see a huge role for CCUS in power industry. The reason I say that is because the alternatives for zero carbon power are much cheaper than putting CCS onto a power station. So CCS then becomes this thing that's needed in chemicals, in hydrogen production, in steel manufacture, in cement manufacture. So that's not, I guess, prolonging the fossil fuel industry, so to speak. That is, areas that are hard to abate. Having said that, the fossil fuel industry is incredibly important in CCS because, no lie, no other industry actually understands subsurface behavior and subsurface reservoir behavior better than the oil and gas industry. And that's just a fact, because you've spent 100 years taking stuff out of these reservoirs. Just CCS, just the same thing but reversed. And you need that sort of subsurface geophysics knowledge to make this work. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks for the answers. That was really comprehensive. And now let me just move on to some of the questions that appear in the chat box. There's one from Ivan. I think this one, Noel, do you want to take it? Could you discuss some applications for hydrogen in buildings? You touched on it briefly in your presentation. I remember there's a few overseas examples. Would you like to add on to some of this?
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Ivan, for the question. Yeah. So built environment is very close to my heart. I'm actually with the Building and Construction Authority. So we are actually looking at various applications for the built environment sector. I think earlier I mentioned about data centers. I think this is one key area where we can see hydrogen playing a bigger role in helping to decarbonize the built environment sector. there's a lot of interest from data center operators who are actually looking at replacing the diesel gensets. I think the key question is what is the scale of this demonstration that they're looking at, the trials, and to actually create that proof point that it can actually work. Of course, the other option is looking at the construction sector, not so much of buildings, but actually at the construction site, where currently, again, diesel gensets are being used, they're polluting the site. Whether there are other ways of actually replacing the diesel gensets with fuel cells, standalone fuel cell systems that can be actually used at the sites itself. So there are various options for us. By even when we talk about the built environment sector, there was one project that was used for clean tech one. If everyone remembers, there was supposed to be a 1 megawatt fuel cell system that was being installed, supposed to be installed there. Unfortunately, the project didn't proceed, but I think it's a good opportunity for the hydrogen and the fuel cell community to explore, how can we take this to the next level? Study some of the challenges and the pain points that were identified in the project itself, and see how we can actually improve and probably identify the next project to actually consider a large-scale fuel cell systems for building to support them.
Awesome. That's a great answer. I really like how you touched on data centers, because we just heard that Singapore may be lifting the moratorium. The region is very big into it. And also, your example of fuel cells. Noel, just one more quick question from another person on the chat. Can you indicate the cost of 1 kilowatt hour unit of electricity for hydrogen fuel, if you know the figure top of your head?
I think, if I'm not wrong, it's if I can remember at the top of my head, it's about $100 per kilowatt for fuel cell. Yeah. I may be wrong. Maybe Mark has the answer.
Yeah. Well, on a fuel basis, I think we could calculate it, but yes, I guess there's two things, and I don't know the levelized cost of energy, so capex plus opex. But if we thought about just the fuel cost, let's say green hydrogen, cheap, $5 a kilogram, and then, oh my gosh, I don't even remember what the fuel efficiency of a fuel cell is, like 60% or 65% or something like that. So yeah, we can calculate that number. But,
I think the estimation, it's about 100 per kilowatt. But again, cost of hydrogen currently is about $10 per kilogram. If I can recall.
And I suppose if I think about where this question might be coming from, I would suspect today that generating electricity from a fuel cell levelized cost of electricity is more expensive than from natural gas combined cycle power plant. But that's without a really strong carbon price pushing it along.
Awesome.
Yeah. Thanks, Mark. Yeah. So sorry I couldn't give an answer to the question. So yeah.
And I suppose the price is always fluctuating, right? When we talk about, you factor in things like supply, transport, the volatile energy prices now with the other fossil fuels, it kind of really just swings, right?
Yeah, but I would, just thinking out loud here, the fluctuations in price for something like green hydrogen, truly green hydrogen, should be a lot lower than what we're currently seeing with oil and natural gas, right? So they're less impacted by the geopolitics of the oil industry.
Definitely an advantage when you bring in renewables. And
yes, right.
I think, cool. And just one more question from Gillian from EcoBusiness. Hi, Gillian. The question is, where does hydrogen feature as a replacement for coal and trash to produce energy? Noel, do you want to take this in the context of perhaps Singapore and other examples you've seen in the region?
Sorry, Langley, can you repeat the question?
Yes. So where does hydrogen feature as a replacement for coal and trash, I suppose, waste to energy, as a form of energy production?
Right. Okay. So I think in this case here, when we talk about the current energy sources, coal and whatever else that's there, high CO2 emission fuels, I think hydrogen will probably, in Singapore's context, I'm referring to the Energy 2050 Committee's report, if everyone has seen that. it's quite surprising even to me that hydrogen will actually would probably feature like being more than 50% of our energy source by 2050. I think that's in one of the scenarios that they have painted. And natural gas will naturally, diminish over time. And we'll see, apart from hydrogen, you also have your renewables and your grid imports from neighboring countries as part of our overall energy mix. So I think, yes, definitely this will be the direction for Singapore. It will definitely be one of the key energy sources by 2050, and that will actually also remove our need or our need to actually depend on fossil fuels in future.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Noel. And the next question, I guess, Mark, you should be able to take this. The question is, some CCU technologies have been found to emit more carbon than they capture in the long run. So are there any kind of CCU technologies you consider less reliable or stable than other forms of this technology?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think it relates in part to a study that came out. It was in the last week or so that I was reading that talks about how, on balance, some of these carbon capture projects are indeed emitting more CO2 than they're capturing, and I guess it's important to look at things as well in the context of how they're presented, but it is entirely possible and in fact probable that CCS does not work exactly as planned, right? And a great example is the Gorgon project. So from my home state of Western Australia, so there's a very big, the world's biggest carbon capture and storage project that sits up in on an LNG facility, and they've had quite a few issues actually with their subsurface injection. So they're unable to actually inject the CO2 at the rates that they thought they would, and regulators are afraid of fracturing. So they've had to scale back, and they end up emitting more as a result because they're sort of capturing from a vent and putting it underground. So yeah, it's as far as the capture technology goes, it's all actually pretty standard. So it's all like amine scrubbing, or it's membranes, or ion exchange or something. So it's all pretty normal technologies that we use, and quite mature technologies we use. There's really not one that's better than the other. When they talk about emissions being more than captured, they're actually talking about, in many cases, the plant being offline, or it's only installed on part of an operation. For example, Boundary Dam was installed on one power turbine, so the rest of the power station was still emitting as it always was. So it's, I guess, to answer the question directly, the reliability of all of the different capture technologies and all of the utilization pathways is generally pretty okay. Where we're running into trouble is actually on the injection side and the subsurface part. And with the utilization, making sure your offtake can take it.
I'm sure there's research, a lot of innovations on that front that we can work on in the next few years. And I like how the question is naturally swinging between hydrogen and CCUS. So the next one, I'm just going to throw it to Noel again. It's back to that question of how much the kilowatt hour of hydrogen electricity cost. The question is the current Singapore's carbon tax of $25 a ton, starting in 2024, I think, is it reasonable to help to achieve carbon neutrality?
Okay, I just share my personal opinion. It should be as high as possible. That would then encourage everyone to shift away from fossil fuels towards more the low carbon energy alternatives. So but the thing, we need to be realistic as well. When is green hydrogen or even CCUS readily available? There was a question about the commercialization of such technologies. Is it available? Is green hydrogen supply ready to come onto Singapore shores? I think challenges for Singapore would be, is the infrastructure ready for it to be shipped over? Do we have a bunkering, storage, as well as processing facilities ready? Are the various sectors already ready in terms of to receive the hydrogen and to look at the various applications for hydrogen? I think those would be the key questions we need to ask ourselves before we actually consider raising the carbon tax. Yeah. But if you want to really push people, then yeah, raise it as high as possible. Then the industry will naturally adjust on its own.
I might just want to chime in with 4 seconds, if that's okay. But one way to look at it as well, so the IEA has done a whole lot of modelling. They have some very smart economists in their room. And in their net zero scenario, which is a scenario, a backcasting scenario that achieves 1.5 degrees temperature rise by the year 2100, they're saying that to support that level of decarbonisation in 2030 in advanced economies, we need carbon prices around $95 a ton. By 2040, we need carbon prices around $140 a ton, which actually then unlocks all of CCS, unlocks green hydrogen, unlocks all this amazing technology, right? And one way to think about it is carbon prices have a ceiling, right? So anyone that's saying they'll go up to $1,000 a ton, that's crazy, because what happens is when you start getting to $200 a ton-ish, then all of these amazing technologies become viable, right? And it becomes then cheaper to deploy green hydrogen at massive scale and deploy CCS where we need to put renewables and batteries everywhere because the high carbon price encourages that, right? So there's just a balance then between economy and decarbonisation.
Mark, if I could just stay with you on that point actually, because like Noel said, there was a question about commercial viability for hydrogen solutions. Just wondering, right now Singapore has mentioned that it has a keen focus on it, but maybe in the region, in Southeast Asia, are there any other regions where you see hydrogen potentially being a good option? Or what are the steps we need to take for commercialization?
Yeah, look, if I can extend the region down to Australia, which is a bit of a stretch, but obviously I'm Australian and very proud of my country. Obviously, hydrogen is a big deal down there. Like it's got bipartisan support. It's both sides of Parliament are willing to do anything to create an export industry. And I was recently talking to the team in Intercontinental Energy, and they have some really big plans, sort of 25 gigawatts in the northwest of Australia and another 30 plus gigawatts down in the southwest. And then you've got Fortescue Future Industries going around talking a big game on hydrogen. So yeah, I think Australia has a lot to gain as an export powerhouse in that way. As far as hydrogen inside sort of policy frameworks across the region, there's been a little bit of talk. Obviously, Japan and South Korea are the big draws, big demand centers of hydrogen going forward. Singapore's very advanced in the discussions. And I think it's just a matter of time before other countries start to come on board. But the discussion is a little bit nascent at the moment. I think Thailand has been starting to talk about it, but that's about as far as the conversations go. And really, what we need is this, as I said before, this sort of linking up of supply and demand to create that industry, right? And get away from or move on from the talking and the planning into the executing.
Awesome. And I mean, there's so much to go on from here, but looking at the time, we may not be able to cover all the questions. So I would just like to maybe end off with a big picture question for both speakers. Briefly, what's your vision for hydrogen and CCUS in the Southeast Asia region, perhaps by 2030? Where do you want to see it developed to really help in the decarbonization process? Noel, do you want to start?
Yeah, so I think 2030, that's probably the first goal for Singapore. Setting the baseline, getting all ourselves ready in terms of standards development, regulations, maybe even training the workforce, upskilling our workforce, getting them ready once hydrogen comes on board, as well as completed R&D projects, going through pilot trials, and identify the technologies that will bring us towards the next level. And most importantly, public awareness, because I think when you talk about hydrogen, there's always a fear that hydrogen is dangerous. I think it's the same thing for petrol when it was first introduced to Singapore and LNG. I think it's a more of a public acceptance that needs to be created. And by 2050, once hydrogen is coming in as a main source, how we live, play, work together in a hydrogen economy.
And Mark?
Yeah, look, realistically, it's 2022, so 2030 is tomorrow, right? That's really soon. So, you know, I do see a lot of reduction in electrolyzer costs before 2030, and certain places are starting to, you know, put in plans in place and have targets around, you know, $2 a kilo, sort of $1.50 a kilo hydrogen, green hydrogen by 2030. So I see that starting to take off, and then the supply chains will follow. I see a little bit of scale up in CCUS, but I think that's going to take a little bit of time because, strictly speaking, you know, if you sanctioned a CCS project today, if you did final investment decision on a CCS project today, it would take you 10 years to develop that project. And then that's just reality, right? They're very long lead time projects. It's like a big LNG project or a big oil refinery. It doesn't happen overnight. So yeah, we're starting to see some of that, some of those discussions happen, but yeah, it'll be sort of late 2020s, early 2030s by the time we start seeing some real action. Yeah.
Hopefully we can scale that up in the next few years. And like I said, there's so much to go on from here. We can probably talk 1-2 more hours, but it's Friday afternoon. I'm sure people want to clear work fast and get home on time. So I think we have to end the Q&A session here. I mean, there's a lot of great takeaways. We talked about cost. We talked about how hydrogen and CCUS play out in their role in the energy transition. And also, you know, like I said, the role of innovation and it's how do we scale things up in the next few years? Really, it's an urgent process, right? So with these points, I'm really excited to see how the energy sector in Southeast Asia pans out. And as I've mentioned, you know, any entrepreneurs, inventors out there, if you like the jumpstart on any efforts you're making in CCUS or hydrogen tech, do check out the Livability Challenge. So I think we can put a link there in the chat box. And also just one last thing before we go, the next Lunch and Learn session is on 6th May, and the topic is on nature-based solutions. So hope to see you there. And just before you leave, we do have a quick survey that we'll put up in the chat box also, just to get a sensing of how you guys enjoy this chat or not. So it'd be great if you could help us to fill that up too. So I think that's all from me. Thank you once again and have a great weekend ahead. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.